Hey, thanks for checking out this podcast. Our hope is that it's an encouragement to you, that it builds your faith, that it helps you be a better leader and a better influencer in and through your life. If this is helpful to you, we'd love you to subscribe and also share it with somebody else to encourage them too. Thanks. Well, hey everybody, we are starting our podcast today. Actually, for us, it's afternoon, but you might be watching this,
any time of the day.
Morning, evening,
midnight,
middle of the night, whenever.
Anytime.
On a treadmill, riding your bike, in your car.
Yeah, we're really happy to have you guys with us today. We're going to be talking all about how to share your testimony, or why to share your testimony today.
Right.
We think that we know that in your life as a Christian, one who follows Jesus, sharing your story is pivotal. Being able to share your experience in walking with Jesus, how God has affected your life, is a massive piece of following Jesus. And that's what this whole podcast is about, is helping you find your next steps.
Yeah, so on a personal level, when each of us articulates our own story, what we call a testimony, right? It helps us solidify our faith. It helps us grasp what God has done in our lives. It helps us celebrate that. And so it's good for our own faith.
Right.
To tell our own story, to articulate our journey.
Yeah, it really consolidates it. Like when you tell your story, it almost makes it more available to you.
Right.
I think my first couple years of being a youth pastor, I would share my testimony maybe once a year.
Yeah.
And it had been a year, and I was like, man, I haven't shared my story in a while.
Yeah.
And sharing it lifted myself up.
Right.
Telling the story of how God intervened in my life, it got me more present to Jesus in my life today.
Exactly. Yeah. It helps your own faith, right?
Yeah,
it builds your faith.
Totally.
Telling your faith story.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to encourage people in this, because I think sometimes Christ followers hear that and they think, yeah, but I don't know how to tell my story,
right.
Or I struggle to articulate my story. But even that, and we're going to give people more specifics on that this week and especially next podcast, right?
Yeah.
But even saying, I don't know how, then wrestling with it is going to be good for your faith.
Right.
Struggling through it, learning to articulate it, listening to other people's stories, and thinking, well, that part fits my story, and so on. That journey of building your own, or writing out, I guess, your own story, is just good for you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. When I think of your story and why we tell our story, I think of Jesus' words in Acts chapter 1. Yep. So this is Jesus, and it says,
see if you can find it.
Oh man, I had it right here.
Oh, no, you lost it?
I lost
Acts
it.
1?
And that is okay. Acts chapter 1, verse 8, I believe.
Okay, you find it?
Yeah, it's right here.
Okay.
It says, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth.
Nice.
You will be my witnesses. So this is right before Jesus leaves, and he ascends to heaven. This is some of Jesus' last words to his followers, and what he's telling them. And I think this is beautiful, because what you'll see in Acts is that the disciples do a lot. They do a lot of different things. They feed the poor. They talk theology. They talk about how to follow. There's a lot of stuff that they do.
Yep.
But Jesus' words isn't that you'll be my conquerors or that you'll be my insert any other word.
Helpers with this or that.
You will be my witnesses.
Right.
And so I think when you're thinking about your testimony, I think one of the most important things is that you understand what you're talking about when it comes to this. So really simply put, what have you seen and heard?
Right.
What did God do?
Because that's what a witness tells.
Yeah.
A witness is somebody who encountered something.
Yep.
And then they explain, how did you put it? What you have
seen and heard. So if you were in a courtroom, and let's say you were on the side of the street and there was a car accident and there was horrific stuff happening.
Sure.
They'd call you on the stand and they'd ask you questions about what happened.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't have to present like this super lofty theological
Right,
argument.
yeah, you don't think, what am I supposed to say here?
No.
What does the lawyer want me to say here? No. You're just giving your own
what did you see?
account.
What did you hear?
Yeah.
And you just talk about your experience.
Yeah.
And in the same way, Jesus is telling us we will be his witnesses everywhere.
Right.
Everywhere. So we'll talk about what we've seen and heard.
So in 1 John chapter 1, he actually starts the book that way, and it's one of my favorite passages in all the Bible.
Wow.
But he just says, that which we have seen and heard. Those are his exact words.
Wow.
That which we have seen and heard. And then he goes on, that which we have handled, that which we have heard with our own ears, that which we have seen with our own eyes. He just keeps repeating this phrase. I think I counted one time, it's like 12 times that he describes that it's his personal experience, John's personal experience. And he says, that's what we are declaring to you. So we're not declaring to you just some set of teachings. Right. We're not declaring to you just some set of lofty ideas. We're telling you something that we have personally experienced and encountered for ourselves.
Absolutely. I love later in Acts. So we start off with Acts, and Jesus is saying, you will be my witnesses from here to Judea, to Samaria, and the ends of the earth. And then later on in chapter 3 and 4, John and Peter are going out. They're talking about the gospel. They're doing these awesome things, saying things, and people are getting saved. People are believing the gospel. And they get some heat. They get arrested because the government didn't like what they were doing. And it says that, It says in chapter 4, the government tells them, stop teaching, stop doing all this stuff, stop talking about this Jesus.
Yeah.
And what they respond with is this. They respond with, we will not stop telling of what we have seen and heard.
Right. How could we? Right. How could we ever stop doing that?
Exactly. So when I see that, it's like Peter and John could have said anything. Yeah. They could have said, we won't stop teaching our doctrines. We won't stop debating with people. We won't stop this, or that. What they chose to say was, we won't stop being witnesses. We won't stop telling what we've seen and heard. Right. We won't stop sharing how Jesus has impacted us. Yeah. And I think that's huge. That is, I think, central to this whole deal is you need to know, the listener, whoever we're talking to right now needs to know that to tell your testimony is as simple as saying what you have seen and heard.
Okay, now let's get a little more practical there, because some people might be saying, okay, but I haven't seen Jesus, or I haven't heard Jesus, or what does that actually look like? Right. So this would be what I'm sharing when I share what I've seen and heard, is I'm sharing my experience with Jesus, my experience with the grace of God.
Absolutely.
And so that looks different for all of us, which is why it's your story, but it might have something to do with your upbringing, how your parents or one of your parents influenced your faith journey. It might be about a moment when you encountered the grace of God. It might be a time when you read scripture or heard someone speak. Totally. Or were beside a stream and you encountered the Spirit of God. Yeah. But it's your experience with God where you encountered His grace, right? His saving work, where you embraced faith. And again, that has nuance to it, and it does. I think a lot of times when people are wrestling with this, and again, we're going to get more into that exact details next week. But I think when people are wrestling with this, they sort of want to know, well, what am I supposed to say, or how is that supposed to look? And we want to be careful about putting too many words in people's mouths, right? Yeah. We want you to think, how would I articulate if I was just telling someone about my own faith journey? And actually, I love to ask non-Christians about their faith journey, right? I just love to ask them, like, so what do you think about Jesus? And have you ever thought of believing in Jesus? Have you ever prayed? And they have testimony. They don't have testimony of encountering the grace of God in a saving way, but they have testimony about moments in their lives where God worked and where they thought maybe there was a God or various things. So that's where we're aiming towards.
Totally. That in your own words, you describe how God showed up in your life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And for any of you who might be doubting, saying like, well, my faith journey hasn't been, spectacular enough, or I'm just me. Like, there's no way I could say that. I want you to look at this verse. It's Acts chapter 4, just in that same passage.
Yep.
In verse 13, it says, when they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized they were unschooled, ordinary men, they were astonished, and they took note that these men had been with Jesus.
Yeah.
You don't have to have any special degree.
Right.
You don't have to have been walking with Jesus for a long enough period of time. It's just an honest reflection of like, what has God done in your life? What has God done in your life?
And here's what's cool about this. This is why I think this is so important, or one of the reasons why.
Right.
When you tell me information, that's interesting.
Right.
When you tell me your journey, that's powerful.
Wow.
There's a difference there. And this is true in preaching. Like if I was teaching you how to preach, I would say, okay, at the end of your sermon, people will come up and tell you that was an interesting sermon if you do a good job presenting information. But people will come up and tell you that was a powerful sermon if you include specific ways that God has worked in your own life. Right? And so that's why even when we preach truth. We've got concepts and ideas and principles that we are communicating. But then we preach personal truth. We preach truth that is through our own encounters and experiences. And that takes what's interesting and makes it powerful.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that, because when it comes to storytelling, storytelling is all about helping. So the story that you have exists to help somebody. So I think of my mother. Her testimony is that she was addicted for a very long time, and she was in and out of prison, in and out of places where, like halfway houses, programs, all that stuff for my whole life. And it was the gospel that took hold of her when I was 13 or 14, and I saw a 180 shift where she picked up the gospel and she got married to the man she was with. They both got baptized and then married the next day at the same program. It's an astonishing story. And they would go on to live a good life, where now they own their house. They're plugged in to the community church that they're a part of. They've got 3 beautiful children that they're raising. And the reason my mother, and I telling her story as well, the reason that she needs to tell her story is so that anyone like her can know it's possible for them. Someone like me can be helped. Is the real thing that you take away with is if God can show up for my mom here, God can show up for me. If God can show up for this person, God can show up for me.
Somehow we believe it's possible in our lives when we hear about it happening in someone else's life. So again, you can hear that it's possible, but when you actually hear about a specific testimony of it, then you're able to move that towards your own heart or in somebody else's heart. You can say, man, I believe that God could do that.
So, and this is, I think, true in all stages. So not just salvation stories, but your testimony in a whole bunch of areas can help someone get unstuck in a bunch of places. I think of, so my wife and I, both of us have childhoods where they weren't quite model childhoods. They were messy, and we were figuring it out. So Winter and I, now that we're raising our kids, we're kind of raising our kids without a net. Like we don't have an experience of it, so we've got to learn from all over the place. And Winter and I have been journeying on that, and it's hard. Months are harder than others. And she and I were listening to a man named James K. Smith. And his wife's story are almost the exact same as ours, where they were young parents. Neither of them had ideal home lives, and they had to figure it out. And even for my wife and I to sit next to each other, listen to this guy who we look up to, say our journey was the same.
We had to figure this out.
Now we think, oh, it's possible. We can do this. We can do this.
Exactly.
Someone like us did it, so we can do it. And I think in the same way, your testimony exists for someone. Your story, whoever is listening to this, your story exists for someone.
Okay, now let me take it a new direction here. So we've talked about how your testimony will affect you, your faith journey. Talked about how it's for someone, it helps other people. Let's just mention, too, about how it exalts Jesus.
Absolutely,
So, Jesus in Acts 1:8, the verse you mentioned, he says, you'll be my witnesses, or witnesses of me. So we're not witnesses of ourselves, we're witnesses of what we saw and heard, but we're witnesses of him. So the goal in sharing our story, our faith journey, is to exalt Christ. It's to point people somewhere. So rather than pointing people to ourselves, saying, here's how awesome I am, here's how great I am, look at me, we're saying, look how great Jesus is. And in fact, sometimes maybe most of the time, it's actually our testimonies actually are self-deprecating, would be the right word. We actually are sort of saying, actually, I'm kind of a screw up. I'm sort of messed up. I'm broken.
Right.
And yet Jesus met me. He came in. He worked. He moved.
Exactly.
And so we're looking for those places in our lives where the goodness of God intersected with the brokenness or emptiness or sinfulness or mess of me. And then I'm able to point to Jesus and say, look how he is good.
Right. I think of in John chapter 4, there's the woman at the well.
Yeah.
And Jesus meets her and points out her brokenness very explicitly, like names the issues she's got.
Yeah.
And her life is that she wouldn't even get water with other people. She was ashamed to be around people. Yeah. Jesus meets her and tells her exactly what she needs to hear and offers her life. Yeah. And what happens next is astonishing. It says she ran into town and told everybody of the man who told her everything about herself. She told her testimony. Right. She ran into town and told them about Jesus.
Right. Come and meet the man who
told me everything I ever did.
Knows all the stuff I did, and they probably went.
Yeah. And here's the beautiful part about that story, is credibility wasn't necessarily a thing for her. Right. So she wouldn't have been somebody in town that people would listen to. Right. But what they saw was the transformation. Right. And the honesty. Right. So they saw an authentic person telling their story. Mm-hmm. And they saw the transformation because she was so ashamed at the beginning of the story, end of the story, she's running into town. And what happens at the end is all the people in the town are flocking to Jesus.
It's so good because sometimes I think we can think, well, I have to be convincing or I have to be an awesome person. Yeah. Like if I was so great and so convincing and so awesome, people would be coming to me and saying, tell me, the truth. And I would tell them the truth, and they would be convinced, and they would now be set free. Right. But it's actually a little different than that. It's more that Jesus is convincing, and Jesus is awesome, and Jesus is good. And we are simply saying, I'm just a witness of this, and I'm just a pointer towards.
I watched this happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that happens all throughout the Gospels, where people who are broken and hurting are healed, or they meet Jesus, and their story is the thing that spreads the gospel. It's fantastic because Jesus oftentimes, sometimes he'll heal somebody in front of a crowd. Sure. Sometimes he will. Yep. But most of the time he heals somebody in a small group of people, and it's the one who goes out, the witness, that leads the thousands to know him. Yep. Or I think of Peter and John when they talk about what they've seen and heard. Yep. Thousands of people come to Jesus. Yep. Your story is the grace God has given you to reach other people.
Yeah, one of the most beautiful ones in John is a blind man, right? Who Jesus heals this blind man, and then it's on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees are mad about that, and there's all these just crazy interactions, and they're like, so they find this guy who got healed, and they're like, who healed you? And he's like, well, I don't know, I just know this guy came up to me, he healed me. And then he finds out it was Jesus, so he's like, and then they're like, well, Jesus is a sinner because he healed you on the Sabbath. And this guy goes, well, I don't know about that. I don't have all the answers for you. I'm not a theologian. You guys are the theologians, right? But what I do know is I was blind and now I see, right? That's what I know. And so I think a lot of times we think, I have to have all the answers, or I have to have this sort of convincing life. Yeah. It's like, no, just come and say, here's what I do know. Here's what my experiences were. Right. And maybe, let me say this, and we should probably wrap this one up, but I think it's wonderful to ask people permission to share your story. I don't think I've ever had anybody say no to me. Yeah. Even a total stranger, sometimes, especially on an airplane, I'll do this. I'm sitting on an airplane. Yeah. And the person beside me, you got this captive audience. And this used to happen more. Nowadays, headphones are getting so, such a thing, right? But I used to just strike up a conversation with people. Right. And then I would just say to them, hey, I'm a Christian, or I'm a pastor. Would you mind if I told you a little bit of my journey? Yeah. Well, it's not threatening. I'm not trying to pressure them. No. I'm not trying to, make them sign a document or something. Yeah. I just want to tell them a little bit of my faith journey. Yeah. And I've said that to friends too. Here in Moose Jaw, I've taken people out for coffee who don't go to church, nothing like that. And I just say, hey, would it be okay with you? Like, I'm a Christian, yeah. Would it be okay with you if I shared a little bit of my faith journey with you? Right. And, then you have permission, and people love hearing those stories. Yeah. Yeah. So.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So This week, we want you to take away this, is that everyone has a story.
Yep.
Everyone's story matters.
Right.
And those stories are all about Jesus.
Yeah.
And you need to tell those stories. You need to tell your story. You need to think about it, talk through it, you know. One of the most life-giving things for my wife and I sometimes is we'll just talk. And I'll sometimes tell her stories about stuff from my past, stuff where like Jesus showed up for me.
Yeah.
And it'll be stuff I've never talked about.
Yep.
And then as I'm recollecting the experience, I think, wow, that's a good story. I should tell that.
Totally.
You'll be surprised how often you don't know the story until you start talking about it.
Exactly right. Mm-hmm. Exactly right. We do that in small group settings.
Yeah,
exactly. We'll ask this question. We'll say, when was a time that you encountered God or God moved in your life?
Yeah.
And oftentimes just a few minutes of thought, 3 or 4 minutes of thought, and certain things will come to your mind that you're like, you know, I've never shared that, or I hadn't thought of that in a long time. And you share that and something comes alive again, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. So we're excited for the next podcast. We want to talk all about how do you tell your story? What's the structure? And we want to help maybe answer some questions you might have.
Get a little more practical, right?
Yeah, totally. So thank you so much for joining us in the VC podcast. We are so excited to see you next time.